Ethan Burke had always been drawn to the eerie, the forgotten, and the decayed. It was why he found himself standing outside the crumbling remains of Mercy Hill Hospital on a cold November night, flashlight in hand. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a fire had ravaged its east wing in the 1980s. Urban legends swirled around the place, stories of strange noises, flickering lights, and people who ventured inside never being seen again. But Ethan didn't believe in legends. As a photographer with a fascination for abandoned places, he was here for one thing: to capture the haunting beauty of Mercy Hill before it was torn down for good. He squeezed through a broken window and dropped into the dark, dust-choked corridor. The hospital was dead silent, save for the distant creaking of old pipes and the occasional drip of water leaking through the cracked ceiling. His flashlight beam danced over rusted hospital beds, shattered glass, and peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with mildew, and the walls seemed to press in on him, as if the building itself were alive and watching his every move. Ethan took a few pictures, the flash illuminating the decayed remnants of the past. As he moved deeper into the hospital, something strange happened. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely. He fumbled with the switch, but the light refused to return. Panic gripped him for a moment, but he calmed himself. He had a backup in his bag. Just as he reached for it, a loud bang echoed through the hallway behind him like a door slamming shut. He spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing unnaturally through the empty halls. No response. He turned back the way he came, but the corridor had changed. The door he'd entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of cracked plaster and bricks. Fear began to gnaw at the edges of his mind. This wasn't right. He hadn't been in the hospital long enough to get lost. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Suddenly, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone. He swung his backup flashlight around, illuminating the dark corridor ahead, and that's when he saw it. A single door at the far end of the hall, lit by an old, flickering light bulb. It hadn't been there before. With no other option, Ethan walked toward the door. As he got closer, he noticed something scrawled on it in red paint, or perhaps something darker. "Enter and solve, or be trapped forever." A chill ran down his spine, but he pushed open the door, stepping into a large room. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, and the light overhead flickered on fully, revealing what lay ahead. The room was vast, with walls lined with old medical equipment and dusty shelves. But in the center were 3 large doors, each with a number painted above it. 1, 2, and 3. Next to the doors stood a tall, ancient figure, its face obscured by a hooded cloak. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You've entered the game," the figure rasped, its voice like the wind whispering through dead trees. "Solve the 3 puzzles, and you may leave. Fail, and Mercy Hill will claim you." Ethan's mind raced. Was this a joke? A hallucination? He didn't know, but he felt an unnatural pull toward the doors. He had no choice but to play along. "Choose your first door," the figure said, stepping aside. Ethan swallowed hard and approached the first door marked 1. His hand trembled as he gripped the handle and pulled it open. The first puzzle, the Room of Shadows. Ethan stepped into a room bathed in soft, eerie light. In the center stood a long wooden table, and on it were 5 candles. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting the flickering candlelight infinitely. The cloaked figure's voice echoed in his mind. Blow out the candles in the correct order or remain in shadow. The instructions seemed simple, but Ethan felt the weight of the danger. He stepped closer, studying the candles. Each one seemed identical, but as he moved around the table, the reflection in the mirrors changed. In one mirror, he saw his own face, but in another, his reflection was distorted, its eyes sunken, its skin pale and rotting. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. This was no ordinary puzzle. Something was wrong with the mirrors. They were showing him futures, or maybe versions of himself that never escaped. He hesitated, then blew out the first candle. The mirror in front of him cracked, but nothing else happened. Encouraged, he moved to the next. But as he blew out the second candle, a loud scraping noise echoed through the room, and the shadows in the mirrors began to move, creeping toward him like living things. "Damn it," he muttered. He was running out of time. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the advancing shadows, and focused. The third candle. He blew it out. The shadows stopped. The fourth. And finally, the fifth. As the last candle extinguished, the mirrors shattered into nothingness, and the door to the next room creaked open. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath. One down, the second puzzle, the weight of time. The second room was stark, almost clinical, with nothing but a large, old-fashioned scale in the middle. On one side of the scale were 5 small stone weights, each marked with different symbols. On the wall behind the scale was an inscription: "Balance the past, present, and future, or time will trap you forever." Ethan examined the weights, each marked with a symbol: a broken clock, a sun, a withered tree, a tombstone, and an hourglass. He understood the symbols immediately, representations of time. But how was he supposed to balance them? He hesitated, picking up the weight with the hourglass and placing it on one side of the scale. The scale tilted dramatically, as if time itself were crushing down on one side. He quickly removed it and tried the broken clock and the sun together. The scale remained unbalanced. Minutes passed, and with every failed attempt, the walls seemed to close in. His chest tightened as panic began to set in. Time was running out. He could feel it, like invisible hands pushing him toward the brink. Then it hit him. The balance wasn't literal. It was symbolic. He needed to balance the symbols of death and decay with life and light. He quickly placed the sun and the withered tree on one side, and the tombstone and hourglass on the other. The scale leveled perfectly, and the door to the third room opened. The final puzzle, the maze of minds. The third room was vast and dark, the floor a grid of tiles stretching into the shadows. Each tile was marked with different words: fear, love, despair, hope, hate, courage. Ethan stared at the grid, his heart pounding. The cloaked figure appeared again at the far end of the room. "Choose the path that will set you free," it said. "But beware, the wrong step will trap you in this place forever." Ethan understood immediately. He had to step on the right words to cross the room, but one wrong choice, and he would be lost. He stepped forward, placing his foot on courage. The tile lit up, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He moved again, this time onto hope. The tile stayed lit, and he smiled. He was getting closer. But then, without warning, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the light behind him. The word tiles shifted, their meanings changing before his eyes. Now the path ahead was unclear. Sweat dripped down his face as he realized the truth. He couldn't rely on just hope and courage. The hospital was testing him, pushing him to confront his darker side. Gritting his teeth, he stepped onto fear. The tile lit up. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped forward again, this time onto despair. It too stayed lit. The final tile was ahead, marked with hate. He hesitated. Was this the final trick? Could he really step onto it and survive? He took a deep breath and stepped onto hate. The room flashed with a blinding light, and then everything was silent. The door creaked open, and Ethan stumbled through, gasping for breath. The cloaked figure stood before him once more. You have solved the puzzles, it said. You may leave, for now. The door behind the figure opened to the outside, to freedom. Ethan didn't wait. He ran out of Mercy Hill and never looked back. But deep down, he knew. He hadn't escaped entirely. Mercy Hill had let him go, but it would never truly let him forget.